Good afternoon. My name is Max Thauer. I'm a senior consultant at Mandiant, and today we're going to be talking about Log4j from the trenches, but basically going through a little about what Log4j is, then going into a couple incidents that I worked related to Log4j. So some of the agenda, you'll hear a little bit about myself, why Log4j is important, talk a little bit about it as an overview, the CVE, the exploit chain, and we'll kind of dive into some of the scenarios, with number one being persistent access via web shell, number two being Cobalt Strike beacon, and then number three being a cryptocurrency miner, everybody's favorite. Then we'll kind of talk about some detection and prevention mechanisms, namely, kind of taking, some of your run-of-the-mill EDR tools and how you can basically see evidence of Log4j exploitation in those tools. And we'll also talk about some prevention and threat intel as well. All right, so kind of a little bit repetitive here. Max Thauer, I'm a senior consultant at Mandiant. I basically do incident response. So if you call Mandiant and you're in the central region, there's a good chance I might work on your case. My January 2022, this year was basically consumed by Log4j. So case after case after case, it's all Log4j for me back in January. And that's my contact info if anybody wants to get a hold of me. All right, so can anybody maybe, besides VMware Horizon, which was in the abstract, name a product or some products that use Log4j?
Minecraft?
Yeah, I didn't know Minecraft did actually, but I guess if it has Java under the hood, I suppose so. But I'd say more enterprise products-wise, there's quite a few items. These are just some kind of high-level items that I like to focus on. Obviously, we're going to be talking about VMware Horizon today, but quite a few other pretty common software suites have Log4j dependencies. So quite a few things are affected. So just kind of talking through the overview in the CVE. Again, CVE 2021-44832. Some dub it as Log4j or Log4Shell. Kind of the rough timeline is back in November. There's an Alibaba researcher that identifies the vulnerability, reports it to Apache. The first patch comes out around December 6th. A few days later, around December 9th, 10th, depending on who you ask, start to see proof of concept exploit code showing up on GitHub, things like that. I believe there are some instances where people have claimed they saw actual detections, or I guess observations of Log4j exploit code being run, maybe as far back as like December 1st, but contested. I think it's kind of more pertinent to the larger web application firewall providers like Cloudflare and Akamai. But effectively, December 9th, 10th is kind of the golden day, if you will. And then December 13th being kind of that second patch release for Log4j. So basically, kind of what is Log4j? A lot of people, probably go on Twitter and they hear about it and they get, press briefings and things like that. Some important piece of code and some, pretty widely available software packages. But effectively, it's a logging library. Why would one want to use a logging library? If you think about it, you're basically, importing packages, right? Instead of reinventing the wheel, we can just use this library that's already written, that works fine, maybe except for when there's publicly available exploit code that takes advantage of it. So kind of talking about the exploit chain a little bit, basically the way it works, you have an incoming request to a victim web server. Basically within that request, there's an exploit string that will have instructions basically as kind of stage 2 of the payload, right? So you basically have these, I don't know if anybody's seen them kind of in action, but it's basically a JNDI kind of request. Basically then sometimes goes to an LDAP server, or what is kind of perceived as an LDAP server, basically trying to pull malicious payload from there, right? So Log4j basically sees this JNDI string, says, okay, let's make an LDAP query for the payload that's specified in the request, basically trying to load some more code. The server hosting the payload would respond with that information, which basically that payload is a malicious Java class. And then basically, the victim web server or whatever the target is would download that class and execute it. Right, so again, it's kind of a multi-stage exploit. You have the inbound request with the JNDI string. Request calls for a stage 2 payload, sometimes hosted on the same server, not always though, but basically invoking that exploit. And then number 3, that payload is pulled in stage 2 and it's subsequently executed on the victim host, right? And this is basically what kicks off, that kind of subsequent chain reaction that you're going to see in the next couple slides. Right, so I didn't, go through the effort of making my own graphic here. Full credit to, the Swiss government cert here. I think this is a really good article of, basically the different, phases of a Log4j attack, and basically some different things you can do to kind of prevent it. Right, so kind of like I talked about, you have that incoming, JNDI request. I think like step 1, you could block it with a web application firewall. If you have things on the perimeter, I encourage you to do that. But I think a lot of these things in commercial software products, there's not really a way you can modify that software per se all the time. So you're kind of left at the mercy of the vendor, right? So let's say, for example, if I had a VMware Horizon server, I can't just jump into my VMware Horizon server and make a config change that just disables Log4j. I don't really think it works like that. Subsequently, you could patch Log4j, just kind of going along the timeline here. But again, you're at the mercy of the vendor to do that. You could disable JNDI lookups. Again, I don't think that VMware Horizon would just basically allow you to flat out make that change, without some type of patch. Alternatively, you could disable Log4j altogether, or disable remote code bases. But again, in some sort of commercial product, that's not always really a viable solution. So we're kind of boiling it down to as easy as it can be. I kind of classify it as you can block the requests with a web application firewall, or you can just patch it outright. All right. So kind of getting to the main point of the presentation here. Let's talk about VMware Horizon for a second. Does anybody maybe use VMware Horizon for work? Is anybody familiar with what it is? So it's basically provides you remote applications and like remote desktop functionality. So let's say in a time of a pandemic, some of us have to work remotely, but we might need to access applications that are within the network. So traditionally, you can log into a VPN and just use that, or you can actually just go to something like a VMware Horizon server and be provisioned desktops or applications on the fly. It's actually super useful as a consultant, someone like in my role, because if I need to, for example, get access to like my customer Splunk instance, they can basically just provision me a virtual desktop. I can log into a Chrome session and I'm basically off to the races. And it's a lot faster than installing VPN clients and going through a whole approval chain sometimes. But effectively, under the hood in VMware Horizon, you have an Apache Tomcat web server, which deep down has basically Java dependencies. It basically runs in this process ws_tomcatservice.exe. So basically, in kind of some of the coming slides here, you'll see that's one of the basic processes we'll focus on. All right, so scenario number 1. So around December 23rd of last year, basically we had a couple customers that had some sort of alert in some of their EDR tools, basically for a malicious PowerShell event, right? So you can basically see, if you do all the forensics, deep down you effectively have this file absg-worker.js being modified. Basically what this file is, it's effectively the VMware Blast Secure Gateway Service. So, under the hood, VMware Horizon is basically running a Node.js application, and it basically allows the application to function, but it's very reliant on this file. So basically, upon the exploit being delivered, what it's actually doing is kind of interesting. It's running PowerShell to do some string insertion. So if you actually see here, it's inserting a couple lines into this file, and basically what it acts as is kind of a mini web shell, if you will. So if you just look at the code on the upper left part of this, right part of the screen here, sorry, you'll basically see, if part of the request includes this long string, try to basically execute, a base64 encoded child process, right? So you basically, you put like a, command that you want it to execute. Otherwise, if it doesn't contain, that string, basically throw out 400. So it should be 200 if it's successful, or 400 if it's failing. Right, so not sure how easy it is to see this here, but effectively, kind of interesting. You could actually just see, side-by-side difference of, the string insertion for the, affected version of the file versus the, I guess, original or vanilla version of the file. So kind of talking through a couple of forensic artifacts, specifically related to this incident in particular. I generally like to start, looking at Windows event logs. So for something like this in particular, since it's basically PowerShell, which is the child process, being run out of that ws.tomcatservice.exe, you can basically see, like a PowerShell command line with, some long, weird, string insertion kind of activity here, right? And basically it's being launched out of that same ws.tomcatservice.exe process. Some other things you can kind of look at, aside from like a PowerShell event log, maybe like a system.evtx file. Notably, if you look at 7036, which is a process starter stop, you'll basically see the VM blast process starting or stopping. So I don't know if you remember, but basically you can see it a little bit better within here on the very last line. It actually restarts the service, so you would actually see the VM blast gateway service start and then stop, which is why we'd have that recorded in the system event log. Some other things you might see, process creation, so basically the child process starting within the security event log, and also you might see some of the activity in like a PowerShell transcript log too. So kind of interesting, when I had first done the forensic analysis to find this file, it was pretty interesting and it stuck out a lot because you could see it was being modified right after the suspicious PowerShell command is run, right? That being said though, someone had already submitted it to VirusTotal, so kind of in my analysis, I go and I query hashes on VirusTotal, right? So you could see though, it's registering like 0 hits out of any of the AV vendors, right? So kind of just goes to show, you can submit something that's effectively not good to VirusTotal, but if there's not definitions for it, and if people don't really understand, even in the AV companies what they're looking for, it's not going to basically give you results, right? And then you can see, later in February, there were 23 AV vendors that did hit on it. So, with time and research, the vendors update their signatures. All right, so scenario number 2. So this one in particular was a Cobalt Strike beacon, right? So basically the exploit of the server, causes that ws.tomcatservice.exe to launch another PowerShell process, right? And it's basically a base64 encoded blob, right? So kind of fun. We get a lot of these in incident response. Pretty easy to deal with. All you do is kind of decode it, right? So enter CyberChef. Not sure if anybody in the room here has used CyberChef. It's a great tool. Definitely recommend it. It was put out by GCHQ, which is basically like the UK's version of the NSA. But effectively kind of allows you to, encode, decode, do tons of different functions on data streams or files. Right, so basically here, we can take that base64 encoded blob, basically put it in, and what do we get? Some, kind of human readable text, basically saying, okay, go pull this file, and then basically run it. Okay, so just kind of going down the chain here. So we will obviously go and fetch that file because we want to know what it does for further analysis, right? So we can go pull the file. Basically, if we take a look at it, we can see within here there's a bunch of comments and things like that, but then there's also another base64 string. All right, so we're obviously interested in that. We'll take a look at that one. Pop it back into CyberChef, and it looks like we just get a bunch of crap. Doesn't really seem to make any difference, or mean anything at all to us. Generally, if you've dealt with Cobalt Strike before, you know there's some other kind of tricks and things you can try to basically decode the payload. So aside from base 64 on this part, one technique Cobalt Strike uses sometimes is basically it will XOR the payload with decimal key 35. So at this point, we're starting to actually see the payload itself kind of come more to life. All right, and then if you wanted to, for example, you could even take that same step after the XOR, and you could basically send it to an MD5 part of your recipe in CyberChef. Right? And then you could actually just go and query that hash on VirusTotal. So you can see, for example, if we do put that hash into VirusTotal, it comes up bad. It's all good news. If you look at some of the detections, Cobalt Strike, no surprise there. If you want to, within CyberChef, you can also just kind of export it verbatim. Makes it easy if you want to do kind of a secondary analysis on that payload itself. So using something like a shellcode debugging tool, there's also all sorts of beacon parsers and things like that. I know Sentinel-1 has a very good one that a lot of people use. If you basically throw that payload into any of those tools, a lot of them will give you what it perceives to be the C2 and then some other affiliated details with it. So we can basically see here, it's pointing to that 185 IP, which we've already seen when we decoded the very first part of this. Right, so at Mandiant, we have sandboxes and stuff which will blow all this up for you. So we don't really need to do a lot of the analysis ourselves, but it kind of just goes to show you there's a lot of different ways you can get to it using both publicly available command line tools, or you can use sandboxes and other things like that. But you can basically see detections, Cobalt Strike, HTTP Stager 64. Right, but if we kind of look at the actual text verbatim, you can see some other kind of interesting things. Number one here, you have a user agent, right? So anytime the beacon is going to check in, with the command and control server, it's going to basically use this user agent for the HTTPS communication. Some other kind of interesting things in this sample in particular, it also has an ICAR string. For those that don't know, ICAR is kind of like a way to test your antivirus to make sure it's working. And kind of interestingly enough, ICAR strings are shipped in trial versions of Cobalt Strike. I didn't know this until like a couple months ago, but basically this leads me to believe that the threat actor that actually sent this out, basically trying to exploit all these servers, used a trial version of Cobalt Strike, and they didn't even know that this was the case. So a little bit funny in that regard, I think, because it's pretty easy to detect this with most antiviruses, for example. And then finally, you can also see the command and control server, so notably the 185 IP that we already know about. All right, so some ways you can detect this one. So in particular, if we kind of go backpedal a little bit, we had that invoked expression, basically pulling this file DRV from this 185 IP hosted on port 8080, right? So if we actually look at the Windows PowerShell logs, or notably like the Windows sysmon logs, if sysmon's installed on the machine, the first interesting item, we can see a network connection to the 185 IP on port 8080. And that makes sense, right? Because you basically are having the victim machine call out to the 185 IP on port 8080 to pull that first part of the payload, right? Then once the payload's executed kind of as it goes down the chain, you can see the same check-in, the same IP, but on port 80, basically conducting the actual C2 communications on port 80 versus just pulling the payload, which is hosted at 8080. All right, so for scenario number 3, everybody's favorite, just a kind of a run-of-the-mill cryptocurrency miner. This one in particular, was for the cryptocurrency Monero, also known as like XMR sometimes. and this was around January 19th of 2022. I mean, this one in particular is not too interesting, I would say. It's just a PowerShell script, so you can kind of just read it with your eyes. No real like encoding or decoding or anything like that, and you can just kind of see, straight up the IP it's coming from. It's just downloading a PowerShell script. Right, so I'm not sure if all of you can see this all right, but effectively what you have here, you basically have an IP and then some references to some other files. Basically, it's going to look through processes that are running, and basically if there's any processes with specific names, it will stop those processes. And basically the reason why it might try to do that, so let's say for example, if this system is already running a cryptocurrency mining process, you might want to kill those processes so that it has more CPU to effectively mine the cryptocurrency and accomplish its goal. So some other things it does, it's basically trying to enumerate a couple other crypto mining processes, right? So basically running a netstat for TCP connections, iterates over all of those, basically sees which are listening on port 3333, 4444, 5555, 7777, or 9000, right? Because these are basically very common cryptocurrency mining pool ports, right? So if it sees the machine already reaching out, to those destination ports, it's going to stop those processes, right? And then basically, goes ahead, pulls a new binary, which will basically be written to disk, and then starts, basically the mining process, if you will. Sets, donate level, which is a pretty good indicator that, it's paying into a pool, right? You actually have a couple of IPs and domains, right? So these are kind of, your mining pools, if you will. And then it has kind of that U flag, which is basically, like the wallet ID if you wanted to, which will basically, allow the miner to identify with the pool, for example. And then basically some other things in here, you can see there's just basically persistence mechanisms as well. So you have scheduled tasks and then also run keys, right? So that when this computer is basically shut down upon reboot, the same crypto mining processes will actually start again. All right, so just some ways you can kind of read through event logs. I'm not sure if anybody has dealt with them at all, but within PowerShell on its own, there are some kind of built-in ways you can do it. Get win event or get event log. You can see kind of on the screen here. There's some example commands you can run, which will basically allow you to kind of find, for example, account logons, or for example, basic C4 encoded PowerShell. Basically, you're just looking for strings and things like that within the body of the event log. Some other kind of common event IDs. You have things like 4624 for logon, 4625 for failed logon, for log off. 4688 process creation, 1102 for event log clearing. System event log 7036, which we already talked about, basically process or service starting. 7045 for service installation. PowerShell 400 or 600, basically to read those PowerShell command lines. Then various items in sysmon can be helpful as well. So to kind of talk through some quick items, as it pertains to industry tools. The good thing is a lot of the tools will actually kind of tell you when something weird is going on already. So in particular, Defender ATP, you can see will help you detect Log4j exploitation kind of out the box. Additionally, here's some services or some queries you can run. If you're hunting for the activity, but basically looking for that WS Tomcat service.exe, running something like PowerShell or basically something evil as a child process. Then CrowdStrike Falcon, it will basically alert you of the same activity. Again, kind of goes back to that WS Tomcat service.exe, launching something like PowerShell.exe. And interestingly enough, you can see the PowerShell process being terminated upon that command line being run. Carbon black, pretty cool. It can help you identify if you're just querying for the CVE itself, and then it will also stop the evil PowerShell process from being run when the parent process is that WS Tomcat service.exe. Something like FireEye HX. We'll kind of throw alerts on the default, PowerShell or suspicious PowerShell rules. But basically, again, it kind of boils down to that WS Tomcat service.exe, squatting a malicious PowerShell process. Another cool one, SecureWorks Taegis, basically kind of Dell SecureWorks, XDR from everything that talks to their Red Cloak agent. It will basically kind of show you all the same activity, but interestingly enough, this one in particular, I actually enjoyed working with a lot. You basically see that same kind of string insertion, web shell creation, event as well, and then you can actually, interestingly enough, see some kind of follow-up activity on it as well. You can see threat actor basically came back, made a request to the web shell, basically for command line, to basically get the context that the process was running as. Then you can actually see some other activity for that 185 IP as well. So just some quick prevention tips. How can you block it? Always patch. Run vulnerability scanners. I think what it really boils down to is you have to understand kind of what your perimeter is, right? If you're going to run, commercially available software products on the internet, you should scan them frequently. You should kind of understand that they're there, because as things like Log4j arise, you have to anticipate that bots and attackers and things like that are going to try to exploit these services. If you have something like a web application firewall in front of the service as well, can be good, because it's going to basically look for those JNDI strings that are trying to exploit your service and basically filter those out, which is awesome. Some other stuff you can do, egress filtering. Basically, stage 1 of the exploit might run. However, stage 2 cannot be fetched, right? So that malicious Java class can't be pulled back to the server, and therefore it's not successful. You can watch for things like outbound connections to malicious IPs or domains, namely something like a canary token domain to basically test if it's working, or you can also look for connections outbound to port TCP 389. Some other things, you could obviously have an EDR product that will show you this activity happening kind of in real time. You could also disable JNDI, but again, with kind of commercially available products that we might buy, that might not be an option. So just to kind of rehash, the I guess graphic here. There's a couple different ways you can do this. Basically, I think what most of us can do, aside from not writing the software ourselves, is basically block the request with the web application firewall, or just patch it outright. Just finally, some threat intel. A lot of the EDR and next generation firewalls are going to have this detection capability built in. So I highly recommend if you have something like this occurring, ask the vendor basically if they have the detections, and I would hope that they should stay on top of it and be able to help you. I personally like to read a lot on Twitter. If you actually go and search like some of these IPs on the internet, there's actually like great Twitter threads about this stuff happening as it came out almost in real time. So it's kind of cool to see that as you're doing your investigation. If people are interested, you can register for a Mandiant Advantage account and get some free intel through there. There's basically kind of like a freemium version for those that are interested. And there's basically a couple IOC links here as well. But I know we're kind of at time. Does anybody have any questions?
Is this more of a server-based attack?
Yeah, so basically, for assets that are running at the perimeter. So let's say, for example, just to stay on the topic of VMware Horizon, it's going to be kind of an edge, device that's going to, be out on the internet for other people to access it. So, in that notion, it would be, directly on the internet.